This century has been a significant one for the news. And when I say the news, I mean just that. I'm not just talking about television news now, but all the media involved in the delivery of news and information to you. Or perhaps the delivery of news and information to your parents and older relatives if you're a typical millennial and don't get much news from television. Television and cable news went from being in control of its message and its medium to a point today where people may just check in on TV, but we know they're getting their information on the go, on their phone, on their tablet, on their laptop, or even just as a tweet or screenshot. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, so let's roll back a bit. Before we get to 2015, we should go back to 2001. And in that year, we had a relatively typical year of coverage through the first 8 months. There was a presidential inauguration, a missing young woman in Washington who'd apparently had an affair with her congressman, and then over the summer, an insane number of stories on shark attacks. And then came September 11th, and this day changed everything. Television riveted us wherever we were that day. And those old enough to remember can tell you exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard about the plane hijackings and the attack on the Twin Towers in New York, the Pentagon in Washington, and the crash plane in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Just ask people what they were doing that day, and you'll hear a recitation of facts as though they were telling you about their weekend. This is in part due to television, but it's also the power of the information we took in that day. It was that significant, it was that overwhelming, and it is still that lasting. What we saw on 9/11 was nothing we had ever seen before on television. America was under attack. Not in a movie, not on a big screen, not in a video game. This was for real, and it unfolded in real time, and it was messy and ugly and very harrowing. There were inaccurate reports early on regarding the plans for these hijacked planes, suggestions that other locations were under attack, that there were fires burning across Washington. But through it all, live television news reporting delivered the horror of 9/11 directly into the offices and homes of virtually every American, as well as to the people across the globe. The images beamed and relayed helped win America great sympathy and support, and also presented the news anchors and reporters who were compelled to cover this breaking story with an opportunity the likes of which they undoubtedly could not imagine. 9/11 made the career of CNN anchor Aaron Brown, who was slated to launch an evening newscast later that same month. It reinforced the dignity of Peter Jennings of ABC News, who within a few years became an American citizen, something his Canadian heritage and great pride had prevented him from doing previously. And it showed horror after horror on air, much of it still not re-aired, of jumpers, of death, and of sounds from bodies reaching pavement. Sounds that stick with you if you have a chance to see this material. To better understand this, consider the interactive nature of what we Americans typically see as news from overseas, from danger zones, from wartime situations, coming directly to us from a familiar and iconic location, all in real time, all consuming. It was that powerful, it was that significant, and it does remain so to this day. There were other stories soon after 9/11 that suggested we were back to normal. There were the anthrax mailings, which were sent to prominent journalists and members of Congress. The person responsible for this was never caught, though the mailings didn't cause much more than small-scale panic, despite the wide-scale television media coverage. A year later, there was the DC sniper who terrorized the Washington region for about a month, picking off unwitting individuals in public places up to the day he and his teenage accomplice were caught. Then there were the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and those wars were covered and brought directly to us like no other. Not just live, like the first Gulf War, but live from the battlefield, from a moving vehicle racing across the desert. We watched this unfold with our favorite reporters or our hometown news team and followed our men and women as they sought to capture Baghdad. Not long after, America faced a second significant domestic horror. Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans dead on in late August 2005. And while the storm didn't do much major damage, when the levees were breached 2 days later, the city was flooded. And those citizens who did not or were not able to evacuate were placed at great risk. And our nation and our media was tested again. There are numerous examples of good television reporting from hours and hours of the coverage. There was also a great deal of misinformation and information that could not be confirmed in the hours and the days that followed. The video selected for you to represent Katrina features Anderson Cooper from CNN interviewing United States Senator from Louisiana Mary Landrieu 4 days after the hurricane hit. Watch Cooper completely drop any pretense of objectivity and independence and instead directly confront and challenge Landrieu for her statements in support of her governmental colleagues. Mark this very particular moment as the one that came to represent the time in which television journalism went from objectivity to subjectivity, from reporting to sharing opinion and perspective. This type of reporting is now common, and it's seen not just on cable news, but on the networks as well. Here you have the very birth of this form of coverage. Screen as well the material on presidential candidate Barack Obama and his ascendant campaign for the White House, and his generally glowing coverage by the electronic press. The nomination and election of the first African American to be president is a story that television recognized and is something that should be considered contextually, particularly given the images of African Americans that we saw in the news from Little Rock in 1957 and Selma in 1965 and at other times in the history of the civil rights movement as covered by television. We also can't ignore the mid-2000s and the excessive coverage of missing young women and the consumption cable news had with these stories. And in 2014, a re-energized CNN fighting against Fox News and the growth that put Fox in first place in cable news tried valiantly to be the one place for information on the missing Malaysia airplane that went lost over the Indian Ocean. But the story of MH370 was too big for even television, and it allowed CNN to become a punchline to many jokes and continued to drive news viewers and news consumers away from TV and towards social and other media.